When I was a kid, Martin Luther King Day was a new holiday. I think the first time that it was ever celebrated was when I was in preschool. And so one day I went to get my hair cut. My barber said, like, hey, why aren't you in school? And I said, oh, it's Martin Luther King Day. And he said, oh, I used to cut his hair. So years later, I'm in college, I'm looking through some archives, and I find the letters of Martin Luther King. And I realized that I was like, let me check this story out right here. So I look into it, and it's true. In 1942, during the war, there was a labor shortage at the tobacco farm in the neighborhood where I grew up. And so they put out a call through their church to see if they could drum up any workers who were like 17 years old, so they're not draft age yet in World War II. And one of them is a Morehouse College student named Michael King, who later changed his name to Martin Luther King. So he comes up to New England for the first time in his entire life, and he loves it. He becomes the worship leader at their group. He's like being, like a pastor to the other students who are up north for the first time in their lives. He writes his mother a letter, and he says, I never thought that a person of my race could eat anywhere, but we ate in one of the finest restaurants in Hartford. And so he just loved living there, and he had this great summer. And then in the archive, there's this other thing, which is that and I know this from being a teenager on that street, it's very easy to get into trouble. He and the other guys got in, maybe a prank went wrong, and their punishment was that they had to call their parents and like tell them what they did wrong, and then their real punishment was they had to go home to get punished by their parents at the end of the summer. So Martin Luther King calls his dad, and he says, Mom, Dad, there's something very important I have to tell you. And they're like, okay, what is it? And he goes, I've decided I want to become a preacher. And they're like, oh, that's so amazing. That is. Yeah, anyway, see you Tuesday. He gets on the train in Hartford, the same train I took the first time I ever went to New York City. Same station, it looks exactly the same. And he gets on there, and he and the rest of the guys are having a great time on their trip down south until they get to Washington, D.C. A guy in the dining car comes through. It was a very specific car made by the Pullman Company. And he pulls a lever. And that lever shutters a thick black curtain that goes in between the dining car so that there can be a white section and a section for people of color that has a different label on it there. He later writes in his memoir, after that summer in Connecticut, it was bitter feeling going back to segregation. It was hard to understand why I could ride whatever I pleased on the train from New York to Washington, and then I had to change to a Jim Crow car in the nation's capital in order to continue the trip to Atlanta. The first time I was seated behind a curtain in a dining car, I felt as if the curtain had been dropped on my selfhood. I could never adjust to the separate waiting rooms, separate eating places, separate restrooms, partly because the separate was always unequal, and partly because the very idea of separation did something to my sense of dignity and self-respect. I don't think there's like a moral to this story, but I do think it's important that we remember that Martin Luther King was a human being. He had been a teenager. He had pretty much everything great and bad about him that we all did, and he used that to change his mind as much as possible. Wish that story could end like all my haircuts did then, with a dusty, stale piece of Bazooka Joe and a tiny, tiny Archie comic.